Welcome to the Blockchain Startup Show with Harrison Wright, a podcast dedicated to dauntless blockchain leaders building our new decentralized future. You'll hear stories, successes, trials, and tribulations as we channel into the lives of high-performing leaders in crypto and Web3. Whether you're currently a Web3 founder or leader, or you one day aspire to be, you'll gain crucial knowledge and insights to accelerate your learning curve, handle this industry's greatest challenges, and make the impact you've always dreamed of.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Blockchain Startup Show. I'm your host, Harrison Wright. Excited to welcome our very special guest today, Ray Dogum. Ray is the founder and host of Health Unchained. Much more established podcast than this one. Ray's had over 120 guests across both the blockchain and healthcare arena. Health Unchained is, how would I describe it? I would say you could almost say that Ray was the disciple of DeSci before DeSci was a thing. Do you think that's an accurate description, Ray?
Hey, Harrison. I appreciate that, but I think basically I would say the podcast Health Unchained is many guests that I've interviewed regarding the intersection of healthcare and blockchain. So that can include the DeSci space. However, I'd love to kind of tease that apart a little bit, because for me, DeSci is not just about healthcare or research and development around drugs or anything like that. DeSci is much broader, actually. DeSci is decentralized science, meaning it could be science can cover many different things aside from health and research and longevity. It could be planetary science. It could be environmental science. It could be social sciences. So all these different types of sciences I would lump into this term DeSci. And, how it's decentralized, what that really means. One can argue it means if it's using a blockchain, but also I like to think about it in a way where it decentralizes the participants of the science. So that could be the researchers, it could be potentially where the data is coming from. It can be how the data is stored and shared amongst the community as well. So many definitions of DeSci out there. So, I'm happy to share mine and dive deeper into it, but I suggest people also do their own research into it, because there's a lot to DeSci, and I'm not going to be able to explain all of it in this podcast, I'm sure.
Hey, here's a random one for you, kind of off the wall. But when you describe it in those terms, do you remember SETI?
SETI, the interplanetary communication SETI, sort of?
So back in I don't even know how long ago this was. I was probably a teenager, so it's got to be over 20 years ago. A lot of the internet nerds at the time were obsessed with SETI, which was, I think it stands for Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And you could run this program on your local computer, and it would collect data. And so everyone was running this thing locally on their machines. I guess they were using their spare computing power to run SETI that they would later use to mine Bitcoin. And then they would send that to, but it was a distributed effort, essentially. And I think you had a couple of things like that followed.
Yeah, actually, funny you say that. There was another sort of ledger type of blockchain called CureCoin a while back. I think it was like 2016 or something. I was trying to mine CureCoin, and they essentially did the same thing, but for protein folding. So many universities and people in the research space was using CureCoin power to essentially unfold and refold proteins in different ways to understand their molecular structures. So I wonder how that's doing now. Actually, I haven't looked at the CureCoin in a while, but I'm sure given the current market, it's probably not doing too hot.
Is anything?
Oh yeah, they had so the CureCoin, I just took a look. It had a huge spike in 2018 up to like $1, but now it's back at like a penny.
Man, that's interesting. So, currently,
I was going to say these coins, like the concepts behind DeSci has been around for almost a decade, I would say. Once Ethereum launched its token back in 2014, 15, the concept of decentralizing healthcare, decentralizing science was there. It just didn't pick up until I think just a couple of years ago, when you had the likes of VitaDAO and Molecule sort of like create a lot of buzz around it. And now it's really interesting what they're all doing.
I hope you don't mind me attacking your pet industry, which is what I'm going to do now. But not a lot. Well, I don't know if not a lot of people know this, so I don't talk about it a lot, but I was in biotech before I got into crypto. Well, not as a scientist or anything. I worked for a company that was part marketing agency, part content platform. Think of like a Blockworks, but with a marketing agency on the back end for client projects as well. That's kind of what it was. It was the Blockworks of biotech. And I remember there was this talk that one of the marketing agency people gave that it got a standing ovation. And personally, I thought it was incredibly cringe. And his talk was around, do you remember that TV show, Chernobyl?
Chernobyl. Chernobyl, like about the documentary?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
it
actually,
was
there was also a show about it, a fiction.
yeah.
A little bit show. Yeah, I do remember that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so he was talking about the show.
Mhm.
And he was talking about how what the show demonstrated is that scientists are perfect seekers of truth that are held back by these. It was like this whole pandering thing, like hero worship of scientists. And personally, I just found it extremely cringe. Because what I found is, and there was a lot of that going on, and there's certain professions where people think, oh, these people that do this must be selfless. This is not true at all. What I found after working in that space for a few years was, the largest audience we had on our content platform was academic scientists. And generally, the big life science companies, it's usually the people that would manufacture reagents, lab equipment, things like that, like QIAGEN, Thermo Fisher, etc. They would spend millions of dollars a year on content that would mostly be read by academic scientists, because the idea was they would get brand loyalty while they were doing their PhD. And then 10 years later, when they work in a biotech company, they'd buy their stuff. It was kind of a long-term investment for them. So the majority, I'd say about 60% of our audience was academic scientists, and then it would be people working in industry, PIs, lab managers, things like that. But the more I got to know that space, the more I realized that what almost any academic scientist cares about, 10 times more than they care about anything else, is where's my next grant money coming from? And you should expect that, because almost anyone's behavior is driven by incentives. If you find someone whose behavior is, not, or they go against the incentives because out of a moral principle, that's actually a rarity. And I think that single thing alone, to my eyes, corrupts the whole industry and what it produces right now.
Yeah, a lot of good points there. There's definitely this insecurity amongst academic professors who aren't tenured as well. So they're definitely looking for all the grants they can get and all the publications they can publish. So I think those are definitely very important for them, which makes sense given the current incentivized structure that universities have right now and have had for, I would say, like decades at least. But what's interesting about that is, especially the funding aspect of it, is DeSci actually is one of the most useful components of DeSci, I would say, in this space right now, is the funding. Being able to get, submit an application on a website, essentially, and then curate money or be able to get money from all over the world from people who actually may be affected by this disease or whatnot. So that's kind of interesting, as opposed to just looking for grants from the NIH, which is currently now in question. Their grants, the federal administration is looking into that and seeing how they can reduce costs. So if we were to lose, most of NIH grants, what academic science and even institutional research science, what are they going to do? Where are they going to get their grants from? It's not going to come from their own pockets, I don't think. So either they're going to be very efficient with how they use money, or they're going to find new alternative sources of funding. Certainly, I don't think anyone wants science to slow down. I think we want to see more science and learn more about our universe and everything around it. So yeah, very curious to see how the next 4 years will end up for that.
Yes. There's some interesting parallels from other industries, right? Like, I don't know if you have any interest in video games, but if you look at the gaming industry, people tend to be frustrated with the stuff that comes out of big studios these days. The quality has gone down and down and down. But in the background, you've had this whole sector show up of indie games that usually get funded by crowdfunding. People will put up a Kickstarter, and then they'll grow a game studio out of nothing by building things that people want. And, it's a decentralized mode of funding, right? And then you also see the same in crypto. It's starting to become cool again to do ICOs. For the longest time, if you had anywhere on your resume that you were involved in an ICO, no one wanted to go near you. That's how low status it was. But now you're starting to see people use these sort of decentralized funding mechanisms again to solve the like you're seeing with not all of them, but people are getting annoyed with certain VC-backed projects launching tokens that they're just enrich the insiders. If you try and get in on the retail, you're just going to get screwed over. So people are turning to this mechanism. It's the same story, just applied in different places, and we see it time and time again, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it feels like it comes in cycles. We saw like the 2017 cycle, the 2020, 2021 cycle, and again now in 2025 and all the meme coins that we're seeing. And it's really hard to predict the markets. Like I think that's something that this is new technology. This is not just a um, computer bits. You're talking about n- community networks that are developing. So these are people that are making decisions specifically to go out there and acquire these tokens for the purposes of either utilizing them somehow. There must be some utilization around them. But to be honest, in most cases, it's all speculation, thinking that the coin will just go up. And that's just something I think innate in human beings is we want to be able to increase the amount of resources we have quickly and easily. And I think that, the stock market insiders have been kind of doing this for many years in the stock market. You can even argue for like, many decades. Obviously there have been regulations to hold back on a lot of corruption and insider trading, and that's worked relatively well. But in the crypto space, it's much harder to do that because a lot of the transactions can be obfuscated, or the identities of the people doing the transactions can be obfuscated. So, but then again, also once it's on the blockchain, it cannot be removed. So there's also that potential transparency in there. I guess what I'm trying to say here is I think that although there are a lot more ICOs or token generating events, again, we're seeing now sort of like the cycle. Um, we have to be careful out there. So do your own research, make sure what you're investing in, what you think you're investing in, it makes sense to you, and don't just click on a Twitter link and invest in it. That's probably the worst thing you could do.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to get too off topic here, but you even have to be careful of PDFs now. Oh, let me send you my resume on Telegram. Maybe once I know you better.
But yeah, there's a lot of malicious sort of code that can be embedded within PDFs. Hopefully you have a good scanner, a good antivirus, anti-malware sort of scanning system on your computer. But for sure, there's always risk when you use a computer that's connected to the internet. But at the end of the day, you need to survive in this world. There's very few jobs out there that don't require you to log into something. So we're going to have to adapt. And I think people are doing that relatively well, just considering the number of users who are on the internet and the amount of activity that's been going on. So this is, we're talking macro level stuff here right now. We're talking about internet users, adoption of blockchain and cryptocurrency. These things are hard to predict, but cryptocurrency and blockchain, I don't think is going anywhere in the long term. I think the way we've been doing things online in terms of online banking and utilizing login security as a form of identification, it seems kind of not the best way to do it, in my opinion.
Definitely. Yeah, I'm waiting for the day when every login is Connect Wallet.
Exactly. Yeah, I think it would make a lot more sense. But you also have to be careful there too. If your wallet that you're connecting is just it's the only way that it's protected is this private key, and you do lose your private key, which can happen. You end up losing everything you've ever worked for in your entire life. So there is cost benefit analysis here on like how we secure our wallets. Of course, if you are a company managing multi-billion-dollar accounts, you're going to want to have some sort of multi-signer, multi-signature sort of wallet in place. You want to have a series of processes in place to move large amounts of cryptocurrency. I think that's something that all the big players do already. There's tons of different protocols to follow that make sense for that situation. But as an individual, you also have to consider, how do you protect not just your cryptocurrency, but in the future, potentially your healthcare data, your medical records, all this important information, your property deed, your automobile license, all these different types of registrations that are connected to your identity? How do you make sure that there is no way that someone can sort of steal or coerce you to give your really protected private key?
Well, as we're recording this, it's only a couple of weeks after the Ledger CEO got kidnapped. I mean, that's a terrifying prospect.
Yeah, super terrifying. And, when, I've never been in that situation, and thankfully I hope never to be in that situation, but I can imagine the fear, right? And the person's, going through the person's mind is like, okay, no amount of money in the world is worth me dying. So they're going to comply with these kidnappers. And I think in the case of Ledger wallet, law enforcement was actually able to recover the hostages. I think it was the Ledger person as well as their loved one or a wife or something like that.
He got his finger cut off.
Yeah, he did have his finger cut off. So he did lose something, but didn't lose his life, right? I'm sure he's thinking about security and safety in a very different way going forward. And that's going to hopefully cascade into other CEOs, other high-level executives thinking about this in the same way and really making sure that their systems are protected. But one thing you have to consider is, law enforcement came into action and was able to recover these people. But what happens in a world where we're cutting out the costs or we're cutting out the budgets of law enforcement and it become private security enforcement? And then if there's private security enforcement, then there's potentially private mercenaries out there too, who can potentially request. And now we're going into like a really scary world. And I just hope that we find a way to really appreciate the abundance that we actually do have in this world. AI is going to usher in crazy amounts of efficiencies in the world. And I hope that we don't continue to try to, steal from each other. I think that's just unnecessary. And, it's short-term thinking, very short-sighted. But yeah, again, everyone has different incentives and different people are living in different situations. And sometimes this is the only way for some members of society to get by. So, yeah, I'm not gonna be able to preach too much on law enforcement anymore, but that's sort of my high level thoughts on that.
On a pragmatic note, I don't tell anyone what I do for a living in person. Well, what do you do? I'm in recruiting. Oh, okay, that's interesting. What do you recruit for? Engineers. That's not a lie.
No, it's not a lie. But one thing I would say is you are online. You have a podcast. You talk to blockchain people. So it's very easy for that person you met in person to just look you up and see what you are doing in the space. And potentially, if they think you're worth it as a target, they could set something up potentially. So, again, you have to really consider in the Ledger case, Ledger is one of the most well-known hardware wallets out there globally. I think these people are targeting high-level executives, but we also don't know about all the targets that have happened or all like the hostage situations that have happened, ransomware. It's not all reported. So there's a lot of consideration there too.
I think it's always a risk-reward kind of trade-off, right? If you have $100 million, you don't keep it in a hot wallet. But if your portfolio is 5,000 and you trade a lot, you probably find you keep it on your Phantom and your Chrome extension. No big deal. For me, I live in Mexico, as you know. My LinkedIn does not say I live in Mexico. My LinkedIn says I live in Miami. If someone really was motivated to figure out where I live, I'm sure they could do that. I wonder, Mexico is known for its security issues, right? It's not as bad as people say, but, they could look through, well, what if I search LinkedIn for crypto in this specific city? What might I find? Well, no one's going to find me if they do that. I don't think I'm big and important enough to be some massive target that everyone's going to seek out. But I think it's just, hey, easy little things you can do to dramatically lessen your risk. Like these people that show up to Bitcoin Miami or whatever with giant Rolexes and this, to me, that's just dumb. Another thing I heard about that people are starting to do is they'll get access to the flight logs of people going to certain conferences, and I'll cross-reference the names against, okay, And then they'll pose and pretend to be your driver so I can pick you up, but it's not your driver. Or I'll pretend to be an Uber or something like that. Something tells me that the situation is going to keep getting worse for a while before it gets better.
Yeah, no, that's actually terrifying. Can you imagine you thinking you're going to have a awesome ride to East Denver or something and landing in Denver, but actually these people are kidnapping you and locking you up in some Airbnb randomly and basically trying to take your wallet as try to basically rob you digitally. So it is scary. It's definitely probably going to get worse just because it seems like there are more targets. So there's more potential for it to get worse. Yeah, but I don't know. That's I'm not too familiar with that sort of space, the black markets of crypto. I know it's obviously a big deal in crypto. Well, one thing that was interesting that I noticed was the founder of Silk Road, Ross Ulbricht.
Mm-hmm.
He was pardoned recently by Donald Trump, and now he's a free man. So I'm very curious to see what he does as a free man, what he's going to be doing as a free man, just because I don't know. I'm sure he's probably dropped all his ties to Silk Road and doesn't want anything to do with that, given like the last, I think 10 years of imprisonment or so. But there are others who are involved in the dark web, very involved. And, you know, that market, I think, is continuing to grow just because it can, just because crypto, the nature of crypto and things and how things go, it's not a bank, so you can bank yourself. There are more tariffs in place now. There are more restrictions on international trade. So people will use crypto because, you know, it's a way to transact money across borders. Again, I'm not an expert in that. My field is more focused on how healthcare can improve with the utilization of blockchain and decentralized ledger technologies. And I think although healthcare is probably the most, in my opinion, the most important industry, just because, you know, at the end of the day, you're a living human being, and without your health, you're essentially nothing. So I think it's important for us to really focus on that as a society. Sure, banking, finance, important stuff to be able to like live and have security. But at the end of the day, your health is, I think, the most important thing. So that being said, it's also one of the most regulated industries, which I often think, for that reason, I think that the crypto world or cryptocurrency or blockchain, it will be, or the healthcare industry will be the last to adopt blockchain is what I'm trying to say.
Mm. I just want to tie a loop on something before we come back to that, and that you accurately assessed we drifted quite off the intended topic here. But the reason we got to talking about security in the first place was when you brought up private key management. And I think that's an interesting point that is relevant here, because how I used to think about this, and I'm sure I'm not alone, was, hey, banks control your money, that's bad. Now you control your money, that's good. But I think the reality is a little more nuanced than that. And what we will see and are starting to see is what crypto technology enables you to do is have a range of choices for how to manage your keys. Okay, you can self-custody the entire thing if you want. That's your prerogative, and that was the default option. But more and more, we're seeing a range of services, like you mentioned, multi-sigs, or you can have services like Casa that will custody your Bitcoin closely. You have institutional services for that. You have services you can tap into where they manage some of your keys and you have the others for a multi-sig sort of setup. In the end, I think the optimal solution for most people is probably not going to be full self-custody, if nothing else from a security perspective, right? Or if you get kidnapped, sorry, I can't give you my money. I don't have access to it. You just make yourself an attack vector. But yeah, like you point out, it's not just losing access to your money, but what would you even do if you lost access to the only copy of your medical records?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, right now, medical records are stored at the health systems in which you went to. So, you know, your hospital has your health record, or your doctor, your clinic has your health record, but they're all scattered. So it's not like one single health record necessarily living in one system. It could be if you're in one healthcare system and you go to the same hospital or clinic brand essentially. And that's great if you do that. But most people, they move, they go out of town, they go to different states. They visit like an urgent care. They might get their vaccine at a CVS. They go to a different pharmacy sometimes. And so it's hard to track it all in one place. And if we were to offer people a way to track all their medical records in one place and then have all the other institutions not save your data, so basically you'd be the one lone independent carrier of your own medical records, it's risky because then if you lose it, you're not going to be able to find it anywhere else. No one can help you. So I'm not a fan of total self-custody for most people for their health records specifically. I think that especially older people, where they have a tendency to maybe misplace their private key, or they just don't understand how to use the technology, perhaps. Obviously, many older people these days are very technology savvy. But again, if you start to think about certain mental diseases like Alzheimer's, dementia, these things can impact your ability to self-custody. That's really important to consider. So you can do multi-sig with your family members, or some other sort of custodian-based process or system can be developed for you.
So Ray, tell me, I know I'm jumping into topics a little bit here, but you mentioned something interesting earlier. We said, hey, I think funding is one of the most useful use cases for DeSci. You know why that was interesting is my entire conception of DeFi has really been about funding. But tell me, what are the other use cases of DeSci beyond funding then?
For sure, absolutely. So beyond funding, I think you can consider like peer-to-peer publishing as an aspect of decentralization, and decentralizing where the data is stored specifically so that it's more easily shared with other members of the scientific community. I think that's extremely an important use case. One example of a company like DeSci Labs, I think, for example, is a really good example of that. You can think of DeSci for marketplaces, more generally speaking, in terms of, let's say you want to sell your genetic information or your healthcare data. You can do that on a blockchain or on a cryptocurrency-based system. And this way you have full control of your records. You know where and when it's being utilized. You can revoke the access to those records whenever you think is necessary, and also be reimbursed for any future monetization of your own records. So that's something that's not currently in place for most people. They don't actually get rewarded for sharing their health records. If anything, they share it for free, and potentially the researchers benefit, or pharmaceutical companies who end up maybe developing a drug based on that data would benefit. So it's really hard to say. The other thing is the likelihood of your data being used to create a new drug, although small, is not zero, right? So I think and the likelihood of your data being the most valuable piece, let's say, for example, in a rare disease situation, there's 10 or 15 people with a specific rare disease. So as a person, your data is extremely valuable. How valuable really depends on so many factors, but marketplaces like that, I think, just pique my interest.
Just as you were talking, I came up with something, and I might be talking complete nonsense here, but it seems if you combine decentralized data collection with LLMs, it opens up some very interesting possibilities. So, for example, no one really keeps good data on long-term impact of drugs. And personally, I'm not a fan of pharmaceuticals, right? They have their use, but I take as few of them as possible. Is my general principle here. I have to take medicine for epilepsy. I never talk about that, but yeah, I've had epilepsy since I was 17. I haven't had a seizure I've had it since I was 13. I haven't had a seizure since I was 17 or thereabouts, but I've always taken the medicine ever since, because every time I'm talking to anyone about it, it's, hey, you could come off it and you might be fine. But there's a 50% chance you wouldn't be fine. And if you come off it and you start having seizures again, it's possible that if we put it back on, it won't work anymore, which is, to me, far worse than the alternative. But the question, what is the impact going to be of taking that stuff for 60 years? Nobody knows. Nobody knows at all. And you get, certain other adverse event problems, I've certainly had. But at the moment, the only way to study this stuff is with extremely expensive clinical studies that no one has an incentive to do beyond what's necessary to get approval. But if you could share data and LLMs could look for patterns in it, maybe you wouldn't need clinical trials in a traditional sense to figure this stuff out, because you could just match patterns with what was happening and you could control for things without a human researcher having to be involved, because the LLM could sort through the data. I wonder if you could have extremely powerful monitoring and data, because at the moment, do you remember the food pyramid?
Sure, absolutely.
So according to the food pyramid, we should eat 80% of our food in carbs, and have a tiny amount of. How ridiculous is that? Yeah, but the bodybuilders was saying this is stupid 20 years ago, and then finally the research caught up with the bodybuilders. That's generally how it goes at the moment. But if you had real-time data collection and analysis, maybe that wouldn't be the case.
And I would even argue, in terms of the food pyramid, is every individual is different too. So maybe that pyramid does work for some people, and I think that should be okay. I think what we need to do is individualize our care. And when you talk about like real world evidence or real world data, I think that's ultimately the holy grail of what DeHealth is. To me, the idea of being able to, for each individual to be able to share on like a daily basis sort of thing, their vital stats, their dietary intake, their activity level, their social interactions, basically the digital twin of you, or your digital self shared online privately to some sort of federated system where AI can essentially review the whole population set of data over time. So if you do have an adverse event, let's say from your epilepsy medicine, it could indicate, what time that was, when that was, were there any other sort of confounding factors around you. It'll look at your genetics specifically. It'll analyze, it'll create an analysis specifically for you, on the backdrop of the entire population, right? So it'll understand you very well, but also the entire population. And that, like I said, is the holy grail and very difficult to do. You're going to have millions of different people consenting their data granularly. So very specific parts of their data, not everything. It's not an all or nothing thing either. So typically now, if you consent to release your medical records, it's like an all or nothing sort of thing, typically. And in the future, I can see our data being more, we could share our individual points of data. Our heart rate would be one thing, steps, diet, you could ECG, all these different types of data points can be collected and shared specifically. I think that's key. And then you'll basically be able, theoretically, again, the holy grail of this whole DeHealth movement is your health insurance premium will be paid by your own data, essentially. So you'll be able to live your life, have unlimited good health care for free because you're providing your healthcare information.
That is a fascinating concept. I've never heard of that before.
Yeah, no, absolutely. This is sort of something I've been thinking about for a very long time. But it's really difficult to nail down, essentially, especially when you talk about centralized organizations and governments doing this, because that'll be really, really challenging. But I can see it working with DeSci, DeHealth, citizen scientists. It's just a matter of how do you build something that can work across the board for everyone. So that's one of the challenging part. Like, is it a product? You have to integrate it into existing systems. So like, you can't just build something and people will come. You have to build it in a way that existing traditional systems can plug into it, essentially. I'd love to go in deeper about that and like the concepts and how a typical day would be in the future for these types of individuals.
For me, I've literally never heard of that before. It's the first time anyone has ever brought that concept to me. I'm guessing probably everyone listening to this is probably in the same boat. And it's especially perspective I've got to have, to me, is pretty interesting, right? Because you hear from my accent, come from Europe, now I'm on this side of the world. You'll find people in Europe love to turn their nose up at the American healthcare system, and people in the States will turn their nose up at the European healthcare system, and they're both correct. The Europeans will typically, oh no, we get it for free. But, well, it's not free. It comes out of the 70% taxes you pay to the government. And then you have to go on a waiting list for 9 months. And then there's so many downsides with that. But then the US system is insane as well. Right? I know people who are paid multiple thousands of dollars a month for coverage that doesn't even cover the first $10,000. And then I live in Latin America, right, where you kind of, as long as you have some money, I think it's the best of both worlds because it's an actual private market system, and for us, it's affordable. So we have health insurance that is, you can get a local plan here, which is vastly cheaper than this, like probably by a factor of 10. We have international health insurance, which the reason we have that is, let's say you pick up a pre-existing condition, or it's actual insurance, not Obamacare, so they're not going to cover you for that, right? So if we were to move country at any future point, we can keep the plan. That's why we have it. So I think the premium this year for 3 of us, 2 of us and a baby, is about $7,000, which is a lot cheaper than the US policy would be. And there's no deductibles, there's no copays. It only covers inpatient stuff. So if you need to go see the doctor or buy medicine, that's not covered. But in a market system of insurance, I can't find any justification for buying the outpatient cover because it always ends up more expensive than if you would just buy the stuff yourself, as you would expect. But if you want to go and see the doctor here, you can go and see an oncologist or a neurologist or whoever you want the next day and pay $40 for the appointment. Now, they'll even give you their WhatsApp. In America, doctors will give you their WhatsApp and you just message them anytime. You imagine that.
Well, what they want to add to that, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say the downside of it is, for us, it's affordable. If you're a working class person in Mexico, you can't afford that stuff. So under the current paradigm, there is no system that works for everybody. They'll have major downsides.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why it is so expensive is because healthcare is dramatically wasteful in terms of how we do things right now. You just mentioned you want to go see a physician, you pay a copay. Oftentimes that conversation wasn't really worth it. Or you could have had that conversation via text and it would have saved whatever X amount of dollars, or pesos, potentially in your case. And I think that AI is going to play a big role here. It's already been playing a big role here in terms of being able to, I don't want to say self-diagnose because I think that's very dangerous actually, but to help with most cases, you can use, and again, I'm not a physician, so I could be absolutely wrong here, but I think that there are many ways that AI can streamline the diagnostic process, diagnostic journey for many patients, and potentially also save money along the way. Doctors are extremely important because they're able to translate a lot of the complex science and medicine and research that's going on in the world to the patient and make it clear to them and help them understand it. But that activity is actually, I know there's no human touch with AI, and that's kind of the one thing that I think doctors and nurses and nurse practitioners all are able to do, is to empathize, they're able to listen to the patient and be with them in person. I think there's value there, but why do they need such a high degree to be able to be with the person? You can have a social aid almost do the same thing in that case. In terms of the diagnosis, again, AI is doing pretty well with diagnosing patients, and we're seeing that now. It's only going to get better. People listening might be like, no, it's so scary. You can't have an AI diagnose you. What if it's the wrong diagnosis? Absolutely. You don't want to start treating anybody based on a diagnosis from AI. But you can get you can narrow down the potential diagnoses using AI. And I think that's something that's really interesting. And not to mention, currently, one of the benefits of AI is simply to transcribe conversations between patients and providers. So this transcription, has been happening for at least 15, 20 years now, where you take the audio and basically you have 2 people having a conversation, a dialogue per se. But what's happening now is it's more than just transcriptions. There's ambient listening. Essentially, the AI can listen to the pitch of the patient's voice. It can detect based on the cough what's going on potentially. So there's a lot more involved, and it can organize all that information into a medical record. So it's not just a transcript dialogue, it's data taken in by AI and then extracted by the AI and then essentially put into place into like a dashboard, into like a easily readable place for the provider and the patient, and I guess you can say the medical team, to just take a look at and easily identify what's wrong with the patient or what's going on urgently with the patient that needs to be looked right away. And you can set up alarm systems for that. There's a lot of notification systems to prevent any serious major issues.
Well, if you think about it, LLM is basically a giant pattern recognition machine, and diagnosis is mostly about recognizing patterns.
Exactly. And how many doctors can read all of the medical journals out there? None of them. They cannot read all of them. It's just impossible. But AI could. AI could read all of them. And I know it's scary to think about that, but I think it's also great. I mean, you're going to be able to help patients faster. To me, it makes a lot of sense.
Same here. And yeah, the point you make about the technology improving as well. When ChatGPT first came out, and everyone was obsessed with it, and I thought it was kind of pathetic. So why are you so obsessed with this thing? Like, people went straight to using it to write their content, which just looked completely cringe. You know, the LinkedIn post with the 10 emojis and the 50 hashtags, like you can just spot them a mile away. But they're dramatically better than they were 2 years ago. And now I use Claude all day. I use it as my deal co-pilot. I use it to little bits. I don't write my LinkedIn posts or tweets or stuff with AI, and I never would, but I use it for things like the show notes.
Don't say never,
podcast.
But yeah.
Well, not for now. Like things like podcast show notes. Yeah, I'll use it for that because again, creating show notes is mostly about pattern matching, and it does a better job of that quicker than I could. But also from a quality point of view, I mean, nobody cares that the show notes are the most amazing show notes ever. They just need to describe what's going on and link to the thing. So I'm okay using AI for that. But beyond the content, I'll give it data, metrics, KPIs from the business, like spot the patterns in this. Okay. Sometimes it'll bring up, yeah, that's okay. I'll take a look at that. So for those use cases, I think it'll be very effective.
Oh, absolutely. I started also using, for Health Unchained, I started using AI to help me with show notes too. And it really depends on how you set up your process. Like, it can be more work to use AI sometimes because you have to reread and make sure that whatever the AI spit out actually makes sense, and you're not putting garbage out there.
And then it doesn't say, join us as we delve into the dynamic and exciting world of decentralized. Shut up, GPT.
Yeah, they're sort of predictable in that way sometimes. But you can also customize them too, which is, its own thing too. So I'm thinking about a lot of corporations, like, for example, McDonald's, right? McDonald's, for most cases, can probably get away with a lot using ChatGPT. And just because it's, there's low risk there. You're ordering fries and burgers. So if you wanted to approach like a drive-through and talk to the drive-through and tell it what you want instead of talk to a person, I mean, what's the risk there? They might order an extra fry for you or something. You can see on the dashboard or on your screen exactly what you're ordering. Say, no, I don't want that. I don't want this. So it's going to save. McDonald's is going to go pretty much full on robot mode eventually. I mean, some places it already is.
Where I haven't seen that. Is that a thing?
I mean, ordering for sure. You can just click the ordering on the kiosk in most places, most McDonald's now that I've seen. And I've definitely seen restaurants. I don't know if McDonald's per se, but there are restaurants that use robots to create the food as well. So there's some people to supervise, but they grill the food, they mix the food, they add the sauce, they put it in a bowl and on a conveyor belt and essentially to the person.
I'm personally not a fan of this development, but I'm sure it has its benefits.
Yeah, I mean, it all comes down to savings, cost savings, because it costs money for a person to be there all day and make the food. So if you can bring costs to the consumer directly, food will be cheaper, essentially. Served food will be cheaper. You're seeing robotics in agriculture. You don't have to have farmers, you can have machines and drones essentially do the watering. There are machines essentially zapping the weeds off of plants with little lasers. We're going towards a direction in society where robots will do all the work that people didn't want to do. But then what are we going to be doing, right? Are we just going to be purely socializing all day long with other humans and just hanging out and being artists? I think that's potentially the direction we're going into, but I don't know. Speculating now.
I think most people have been in crypto or entrepreneurship for any period of time, gone through this similar sort of process. But for me, for the longest time, how I ended up starting my own business to begin with was, I think at the time I had a job that I absolutely detested. And if you've ever been there, you know how much it sucks. And I didn't really see where else to go. I was sort of kind of trapped. So my motivation at the time was, I need to get out of this at any cost. So my whole thing was driven by, how can I make money as quickly as possible so I can retire? And now, we're several years later, and I actually enjoy what I do, some days more than others, which I think is true for anyone. But I think about it, I thought, okay, we're on the cusp of a situation where that can actually occur. I'm thinking, what would I do?
The whole creator economy is built on this premise. There's an individual out there who's very hyper-focused on a specific thing. Let's say it's chemistry or something, and they start making videos on chemistry, and they build a community around this. And there's not many jobs. I mean, there's many jobs related to chemistry, but not one where you can just take videos of doing relatively, controlled experiments with video, on your own time, essentially, how you want to do it, where you want to do it. I think that's the cool thing about the creator economy. You can take any niche interest and turn it into a business. I mean, the concept of using blockchain for healthcare, when I first started Health Unchained, people laughed at me. It was something of a joke, because blockchain was associated with basically just Bitcoin and fake cryptocurrencies that are going to get your, get your computer hacked or something. So there was a lot of fear around blockchain, and to combine that with healthcare seemed idiotic at the time. But the reason I went full force into it was because I do believe in the power of decentralization, broadly speaking, and the power of peer-to-peer connection, peer-to-peer interactions. I think that's something that we all actually long for. We don't want to be sheep in an institution. We don't want to feel that way. We want to be an individual, our own sovereign person. And blockchain enables that. It essentially enables something that people have been longing for millennia. And of course, you're going to have people who take advantage of this incredible technology, hence the meme coins. But eventually, you're going to have people building really important products on this. And we're seeing that already with a lot of, in cases of DeSci, in gaming, absolutely, there's a lot of ability to own your own assets in the gaming world, as opposed to having a centralized company be able to take away your special sword. I'm not much of a gamer, but I just want to use that example as a very early adopter of blockchain, and low risk. It's not highly regulated, the gaming industry, as healthcare is. Even finance is more regulated than gaming, as far as I know. So, yeah.
So on a pragmatic note, business opportunities for founders in DeSci or existing crypto businesses, what do you think that looks like right now?
Absolutely. So if you're looking to start a business in crypto or in DeSci, I think it's super important to understand how you're going to build your community. And what that means is, if you are generating a token for your company, you have to be able to understand what that tokenomics is going to look like, not just in the next 2 to 3 months, but really years down the line, and thoughtfully curate your initial users, make sure that your product, whatever you're building, makes a lot of sense and is easy to use. One thing that's I'm thinking about a lot now, as I mentioned earlier, is the AI space. Like integrating AI into your product is going to become essential and necessary. If you don't use AI, another competitor will, and they'll outcompete you in many cases. But again, you have to thoughtfully use AI as well, because there's many outputs of AI that are complete garbage and potentially even dangerous, especially when you talk about healthcare. So just think really hard about that, and make sure you have good advisors too. I think that's important, because without your community and advisors, your kind of and your actual users, you're going to be building something that no one's going to want to use. So it's important to consider.
I wonder what if you were to actually analyze it, which is another thing we could use LLMs for. What percentage of crypto businesses are really just vaporware with a token pump?
Probably at least I would say 95%. They just have an idea, white paper potentially, really cool looking website, community managers and branding managers who pump up the coin, talk about how important and amazing their quote unquote blockchain is. And yeah, I would be very wary of investing in these types of new coins. Any new coins, honestly. You should probably, if you're planning to invest in an ICO or a new coin, really do your diligence, know what you're getting yourself into, because there's high chance that it's just going to go to zero in a couple of years. That's what's happened in the past, and that's probably what will happen for the foreseeable future. One outlier, of course, I think everyone would agree is Bitcoin, because it has no sort of team around it, no like centralized team. It just sort of is run by miners and nodes, and it's completely decentralized, globally speaking. That's one that you might want to was worth putting some as a hedge.
What are the big sort of problem spaces that need to be solved right now that could be solved with DeSci?
Yeah, so one thing we touched upon earlier was citizen scientists. So I think there's this movement in DeSci to enable individuals to submit or share their data. That could be their activity data, heart rate data, anything like that. But it's a really big problem because most people do it for a little while. They share their data. And then after a couple months, they realize, they're not getting enough value from it. And they just sort of stop. They don't want to share. Another part of the problem with that is where a lot of these DeSci companies haven't been audited. So the way they actually potentially could use your data might not be clear unless they're totally open source and you know how to read code. It's still a danger to share your data with some of these companies. So please do your due diligence and know what you're getting yourself into. Another part of DeSci that I think is important is just this concept of peer-to-peer science happening. So scientists sharing data, not just on themselves as individual scientists, but let's call it research data, investigational research data, sharing it with the community in a way that they're recognized as one of the contributors of this pool of data. So instead of scientists and researchers and different academic institutions competing with each other, they can work together. I think that's something that can be enabled with DeSci, and we're already seeing it. The number of collaborations are continuing to increase. DeSci has become more recognized. You look at Nature, the journal, which is one of the most respected journals in science. They're talking about DeSci and how it can potentially supplant the way current publishing works for scientific journals. And I think that's great. It costs thousands of dollars to publish your article in a journal right now. It should be free. If you're a scientist and you're generating this data and you're taking the time and effort to investigate a specific problem in science and you conclude something important, you want to share that with the world, why should you be paying more to just get it published in a journal? I think it should be free. Open access is something that is enabled with DeSci. And the list continues to grow.
I'd never thought of it from that angle before, but you just brought to mind that the same way we have open source software, you can go and check out anybody's code on GitHub. We take that for granted now, but for the longest time, that wasn't the case. You could have the same thing with research data pretty soon.
Exactly. So open science, this concept of open science has been around for a while, of sharing, even pre-DeSci, pre-blockchain, but there was no way to implement it. It was just not possible. The technology to make that really happen it wouldn't work. But now with blockchain and these decentralized technologies, you can build an open science platform. Research Hub is a good concept. I think it's worth sharing with the audience. And I think, what they're doing is essentially building a community where you can have different scientists collaborating with each other. You can ask questions, you can submit your papers. So it's a really interesting future, hopefully, that we're entering. It's just a matter of communicating how to do that, ironing out all the details. All the edge cases need to be considered because, you don't want to publish bad data and have it go through multiple iterations and other scientists using that bad data, and that can also be wasteful too.
100%. Well, hey, I think that's actually the perfect, inspiring future vision to end on here.
Thank you. Yeah. And if anyone's interested in learning more about DeSci space, definitely check out Health Unchained podcast. I recorded over 120 episodes with people who are also passionate about making healthcare a better place using blockchain technology. And I think, we're all observers of the future. So we're all waiting to see what will happen. And Harrison, I just want to thank you again so much for your time and for letting me be on your podcast and talking about DeSci and all these things. And yeah, thanks to the audience for also listening.
Ray, it's been a real pleasure having you. Last thing, beyond the podcast, if someone wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, LinkedIn is probably the best way. Ray Dogum, you could find me there. My website is healthunchained.org. You can also set up a meeting with me if you'd like to chat, and I'm happy to listen to your concepts and ideas. And I think there's so many ways to build here, so I'm excited for the future.
Awesome. Well, Ray, thanks. It's been really, really great having you. A lot of the time, we're pretty focused on the show on what is this tactical thing you can implement to achieve X result. And sometimes I like taking a little more of a philosophical dive, which I feel like we've done this time. It's been really fun.
Absolutely. Thanks, Harrison.
Anytime. And to everyone listening, thanks for tuning in to the Blockchain Startup Show, and we'll see you soon.